Have you ever walked past someone on the street
Thank you, Lord.
without knowing they were only one miracle away from changing the world? This is the story of Grace, a young woman who lost her home, her family, and almost her faith. Everyone saw a homeless stranger. No one imagined she would one day become the reason thousands of people believed in miracles again. This is her story. The wind howled through the city streets, carrying scraps of paper and the smell of rain. People hurried home, shielding themselves with umbrellas and coats. No one noticed the young woman sitting quietly on a bench near the old bus station. Her clothes were worn. Her shoes were torn. Her hair was damp from the cold drizzle. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm. Her name was Grace. She was 26 years old, and she had nowhere to go. She looked up at the grey sky. Lord, if you can still hear me,
Lord, if you can still hear me,
please don't let this be the end of my story.
Please don't let this be the end of my story.
A tear rolled down her cheek. Only 3 years earlier, Grace had been known as the happiest employee at Miller's Bakery. Every morning before sunrise, she greeted customers
Here is
with
your
a smile
fresh croissant.
that seemed to brighten the room.
Thank you so much.
She loved baking because it reminded her of home. Her mother had taught her everything she knew.
Every loaf of bread carries a little love,
her mother would always say. Grace laughed whenever she heard those words.
That's true, Mom. Your bread must be overflowing
with love. The two laughed together as flour covered the kitchen table. Their little apartment wasn't fancy. The furniture was old. The wallpaper was peeling. But it was filled with warmth. It was home. Grace never knew her father. Her mother had raised her alone, working 2 jobs while still finding time to encourage her daughter. Whenever life became difficult, her mother would hold Grace's hands and say, "Promise me something."
Promise me something.
What is it?
No matter how dark
No matter
life
how
becomes,
dark life becomes,
I
never stop
promise.
believing that tomorrow can be better. Grace would always smile. "I promise." At the time, those words sounded simple. She had no idea how much she would need them. Everything changed one autumn morning. Grace was preparing breakfast when she heard a loud crash from the living room. She ran toward the sound. "Mom!" Her mother lay unconscious on the floor. Grace immediately called an ambulance. Minutes felt like hours as paramedics rushed her mother to the hospital. Grace sat in the waiting room praying harder than she had ever prayed before. Doctors moved quickly. Nurses whispered to one another. Finally, a doctor walked toward her. His expression told the story before his words did. "I'm so sorry."
I am so sorry.
The
We
room
lost her.
became silent. Grace couldn't hear anything else. It felt as though the world itself had stopped turning. The funeral was small. Only a handful of neighbors attended. As everyone slowly left the cemetery, Grace remained standing beside her mother's grave. Rain began to fall. She didn't move. She whispered, "I don't know how to do life without you." The only answer was the sound of the rain. Grief followed her everywhere. At work, she accidentally burned bread. She forgot customer orders. She stared blankly into space. One afternoon, her manager gently called her into his office. Grace,
You're one of the kindest people I've ever hired. But business
She looked up hopefully. But business has
been
been
slow.
Her heart sank. "We have to let someone go."
We have to let someone go.
Silence
I
filled the
understand.
room.
I'm true.
Grace nodded before he could finish. I
understand."
understand." Her manager handed her the final paycheck. I'm truly sorry."
It's okay.
Grace
Understand.
forced
I'm
a
truly
smile.
sorry.
It's okay.
"It's okay." But the moment she walked
Sorry.
It's okay.
outside, she burst into tears. Weeks turned into months. She searched everywhere for another job. Every interview seemed promising. Every ending was the same. "We'll call you." No one ever called. Her savings slowly disappeared. One bill after another arrived. The electricity was shut off. The refrigerator became empty. One evening, she opened the cupboard. Inside sat one lonely can of soup. She smiled sadly. Well, I guess that's dinner. The landlord knocked on her door. I've waited as long as I can. Grace lowered her head. I'm trying. I know. He sighed. But the bank won't wait for either of us. He quietly handed her an eviction notice. You have 3 days. For the next 72 hours, Grace packed everything she owned into 2 bags. Each item carried a memory. A family photograph. Her mother's favorite coffee mug. A knitted scarf. And an old Bible with worn pages and handwritten notes in the margins. Inside the cover, her mother had written, Grace, if you're reading this during one of life's storms, remember this. God sees what everyone else overlooks. Grace pressed the Bible against her chest and cried. 3 days later, she locked the apartment for the last time. The landlord stood quietly nearby. I'm sorry. Grace nodded. So am I. She picked up her bags and walked away without looking back. She had no destination. Only a sidewalk ahead of her. That first night was the hardest. She found an empty bus shelter and sat alone. The city lights seemed colder than ever. Cars rushed past. People laughed as they walked home. Families gathered for dinner. Life continued. No one noticed the young woman trying not to cry. She whispered, I used to have a home. A cold breeze answered. Just before sunrise, an elderly street cleaner stopped sweeping. He noticed Grace shivering. Without saying a word, he placed a cup of hot coffee beside her. It's fresh. Grace looked up. You don't even know me. He smiled. I don't have to. Before she could thank him, he continued sweeping down the street. Grace watched him disappear into the morning fog. For the first time in weeks, she realized something important. Even in the darkest moments, kindness still existed. She just didn't know that the greatest act of kindness, the miracle that would change her entire life, was only days away. The first night without a home had been painful, but the days that followed would test Grace in ways she never imagined. She quickly learned that losing a house was only the beginning. The hardest part of being homeless wasn't the cold, it wasn't the hunger, it wasn't even the uncertainty. The hardest part was becoming invisible. Every morning before sunrise, Grace folded the old blanket she had found behind a donation center and packed her few belongings into her faded backpack. She never wanted anyone to think she was making a sidewalk her home. She spent her days walking from one business to another, asking the same question. You hiring? Most people barely looked up. Some simply pointed to a sign that read, No vacancies. Others took her resume politely. We'll let you know. She smiled and thanked them every time. Deep inside, she knew the answer before she walked out the door. One afternoon, Grace stopped at a small grocery store. She counted the coins in her hand. They were barely enough for a loaf of bread. As she reached the checkout counter, she realized she was short by a few coins. I'm sorry, she whispered to the cashier. I'll put it back. Just then, an elderly woman standing behind her stepped forward. Pay for it. Grace turned quickly. Oh no, I couldn't ask you to do that. Woman smiled warmly. You didn't ask. She paid for the bread and gently placed it in Grace's hands. When life blesses you again, she said, bless someone else. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I promise. Woman disappeared into the crowd before Grace could even learn her name. That night, rain poured across the city. Grace searched desperately for somewhere dry. Every shelter she visited was full. She stood beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, hugging her backpack tightly. Thunder cracked overhead. The rain soaked her clothes within minutes. She shivered uncontrollably. Lord, she whispered, I'm trying to stay strong, but I'm trying to stay strong, but I'm so tired. For a brief moment, she wondered if anyone would even notice if she disappeared.
I made you a promise,
Then
Mom.
she remembered
I'm
her
going to keep
mother's
it.
words. Never stop believing that tomorrow can be better. Grace wiped away her tears. I made you a promise, Mom. I'm going to keep it. The next morning, Grace walked to a nearby park to warm herself in the sunlight. As she sat quietly on a bench, she noticed a little boy chasing a bright red balloon. The balloon slipped from his hand and floated toward a busy street. Without thinking, Grace ran after it. She caught the balloon just before it drifted into traffic. The little boy hugged it tightly. Thank you. His mother hurried over. For a moment, she looked frightened when she saw Grace's worn clothes, but then she noticed the balloon in her son's hands. I'm sorry, she said softly. I judged you before I knew you. Grace smiled. It happens. Mother reached into her purse and handed Grace a small paper bag. Inside was a fresh sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. It isn't much, she said. It's more than enough, Grace replied. As they walked away, the little boy waved. Bye, Miss Grace. She waved back, smiling for the first time in days. Weeks passed. Grace never stopped searching for work. She cleaned herself in public restrooms before every interview. She brushed her hair with a small comb she carried in her backpack. She tried to look confident, even when she felt broken inside. One afternoon, she finally received a call. A restaurant wanted to interview her. Her heart raced. This is it, she whispered. She arrived early. The manager welcomed her with a smile. The interview went well. Then came the final question. Where do you live? Grace hesitated. She didn't want to lie. I'm currently staying wherever I can. Manager's expression changed. I'm sorry, he said quietly. We need someone with stable housing. Grace nodded politely. I understand. She walked outside, holding back tears until the door closed behind her. Then she cried, not because she had been rejected, but because she felt trapped. She couldn't get a home without a job, and she couldn't get a job without a home. That evening, Grace wandered through the city until she heard music. Soft voices drifted through the air. She followed the sound and found herself standing outside a small church. Light spilled through the stained glass windows. Inside, people were singing with joy. Grace stood at the bottom of the steps. She wanted to go in. She wanted to feel that warmth, but she looked down at her muddy shoes and torn jacket. Think I don't belong, she whispered. She turned to leave. Just then the church doors opened. An elderly man with kind eyes stepped outside. He noticed Grace immediately. Instead of asking why she was there, he smiled. You look like someone who's been carrying the weight of the world. Grace tried to smile. I'm okay. Man chuckled gently. My daughter used to say the same thing whenever she wasn't. Grace looked surprised. You have a daughter? I did. His smile faded for a moment. I lost her many years ago. The first time in months.
I lost her
Grace
many
met
years
someone
ago.
who understood grief. My name is Samuel, he said, extending his hand.
I don't have anything to
Would
give.
you do an old man a favor? Grace looked
You don't owe me
confused.
anything.
What kind of favor? Come inside and share a bowl of hot soup with me. She hesitated. I don't have anything to give. Samuel smiled. You don't owe me anything. He looked toward the church doors and said words Grace would never forget. This place isn't for people who have everything together. It's for people who need hope. Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. Slowly, she took the first step toward the church. She had no idea that one small step would become the beginning of the miracle she had been praying for. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic signs. Sometimes they begin with a bowl of hot soup, a warm smile, and one person who chooses to see you when everyone else looks away. Grace stepped inside the church with trembling hands. The warmth hit her first. Then came the smell of homemade soup and freshly baked bread. For a moment, she closed her eyes. It reminded her of the little kitchen she once shared with her mother. The memories almost brought her to tears. Several church members noticed Grace. She expected suspicious looks instead. A smiling elderly woman walked over. Welcome, dear. She handed Grace a clean towel. You must be freezing. Another volunteer placed a bowl of chicken soup in front of her. A young boy smiled and said, I'm glad you're here. Grace couldn't remember the last time strangers had welcomed her like family. She bowed her head and quietly whispered, Thank you, Lord. After dinner, Samuel invited Grace to sit with him in the empty sanctuary. Colorful light streamed through the stained glass windows. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. Been carrying a heavy burden? Grace nodded. Then, for the first time since losing her mother, she told someone everything. She spoke about the hospital, the funeral, losing her job, the eviction, the endless rejection, the nights she cried herself to sleep on cold sidewalks. When she finished, tears filled her eyes. I prayed every day, she whispered, but it felt like heaven was silent. Samuel gently opened the old Bible resting on his lap. My wife used to say something when life didn't make sense.
When life didn't make sense. Just because God is quiet doesn't mean he's absent.
Grace looked down.
I want to believe that.
Samuel reached into his pocket and handed her a small wooden cross. I carried this through some of the hardest years of my life. Grace looked surprised. I can't take this. I want you to. When you feel alone, he said, hold it and remember that hope is never farther away than your next prayer. Grace closed her fingers around the cross. For the first time in months, she felt something she thought she had lost forever, hope. That evening, Samuel introduced Grace to Pastor Michael. The pastor listened carefully as Samuel explained her situation. Without hesitation, Pastor Michael smiled. Church has a small shelter behind the building. Grace stared in disbelief. You mean, I can stay there, as long as you need? Tears streamed down her face. I don't know how to thank you, Pastor Michael replied. One day you'll thank us by helping someone else. At the time, Grace didn't understand those words. Years later, they would define her entire life. The church shelter wasn't fancy. It had simple bunk beds, clean blankets, and warm meals. But to Grace, it felt like a palace. That night, before climbing into bed, she took out her mother's Bible. A folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. She had never seen it before. With shaking hands, she unfolded it. It was a letter, in her mother's handwriting. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, life has probably become harder than either of us imagined. I may not be there to hold your hand, but I want you to remember something. You were never created to stay in your pain. God will use every tear you've cried to comfort someone else one day. Don't let suffering make your heart hard. Let it make your heart kind. I love you forever. Mom, Grace hugged the letter tightly and wept. But these weren't tears of despair, they were tears of healing. The following morning, Grace asked if she could volunteer around the church. She swept the floors, prepared meals, washed dishes, organized donated clothes. She worked with joy, never complaining. Her kindness caught everyone's attention. One afternoon, Samuel smiled as he watched her comfort an elderly woman who had lost her husband. You have a gift, he said. Grace looked confused. I do. You know how to heal hurting hearts, because yours has been broken. A week later, a local cafe owner named Mrs. Carter visited the church to deliver food donations. She noticed Grace carefully arranging boxes and greeting every volunteer with a smile. Samuel quietly told her Grace's story. Mrs. Carter watched for a few moments before walking over.
Have you ever worked in a bakery?
Yes, for
Grace's
several
eyes
years.
widened.
I'm looking for
Yes,
someone
for several
reliable.
years.
I don't
Carter
have much.
smiled.
I didn't
I'm
ask what
looking
you
for
have.
someone
I asked if you'd
reliable.
like a chance.
Grace's heart
More
began
than
to
anything.
race. I don't have much. Carter interrupted gently. I didn't ask what you have. She smiled warmly. I asked if you'd like a chance. Grace's voice trembled. Than anything. Carter handed
More
her a
than
business
anything.
card.
My cafe opens
at 7 tomorrow morning. Grace stared at the card. It felt unreal. After months of closed doors, one had finally opened. That evening, Grace found Samuel sitting alone in the sanctuary. She held up the business card. I got an interview. Samuel smiled. No, Grace looked confused. What do you mean? He chuckled. You got an opportunity. He pointed toward the stained glass window where the evening sunlight painted the floor with brilliant colors. Miracles aren't always sudden, Grace. Sometimes they're built one faithful step at a time. Grace smiled through tears. For the first time since losing everything, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was excited for it. Little did she know. The interview the next morning would not only change her life, it would begin a journey that would one day make her the miracle someone else had been praying for. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't that your life changes, it's that your changed life becomes someone else's miracle. Grace barely slept that night. The business card Mrs. Carter had given her rested on the small table beside her bed at the church shelter. She looked at it one last time before closing her eyes. Lord, she whispered, if this door is from you, help me walk through it with courage. The next morning, Grace arrived at the cafe 30 minutes early. The sun had just begun to rise. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cool morning air. For a moment she closed her eyes. It reminded her of baking with her mother. She smiled through tears. This one's for you, Mom. Mrs. Carter unlocked the front door. You really are early. Grace smiled nervously. I didn't want to be late. Carter laughed. Good answer. Come inside. Instead of asking Grace to sit for a formal interview, Mrs. Carter handed her an apron. Let's bake. Grace blinked in surprise. That's the interview, Mrs. Carter nodded. I can teach recipes, she smiled. I can't teach honesty, kindness, or hard work. Grace tied on the apron. Within minutes, she was kneading dough with confidence. She carefully measured every ingredient. She cleaned as she worked. She greeted customers with genuine warmth. One elderly customer smiled
Here is
after
your
tasting
fresh
her bread.
croissant.
This tastes like home.
Thank you so much.
Grace's eyes filled with tears. Those were the exact words people used to say about her mother's baking. The end of the day, Mrs. Carter called Grace into her office. Made my decision. Grace held her breath. Mrs. Carter smiled. Hired. Grace covered her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Carter walked over and hugged her. You don't have to say anything. Then she added softly, Just promise me you'll never stop believing in yourself again." Grace nodded. "I promise." Weeks turned into months. Grace became the heart of the cafe. She remembered customers' names. She greeted everyone with kindness. She often gave free bread to people who looked hungry. When Mrs. Carter noticed, she asked, "Why do you always help them?" Grace smiled. "Because I know what it feels like to wonder where your next meal will come from." Mrs. Carter simply nodded. "Then keep doing it." Grace saved every paycheck. She never wasted a single dollar. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter surprised her with a small envelope. Inside was a key. Grace looked confused. "What's this, Mrs. Carter?" smiled. "It's the apartment above the cafe."
This is the key to
Grace
your
stared at
apartment.
her. "I can't afford that."
Thank you very
don't
much,
have to."
Ma.
Grace's
I am
eyes
so
widened.
very
"What?
grateful.
It's yours." Grace burst into tears.
You are a good
Mrs.
child,
Carter
Grace.
continued. "You've helped rebuild this cafe. Consider this my way of helping rebuild your life." That evening, Grace unlocked the apartment door. It wasn't luxurious. It had simple furniture, a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a window overlooking the
I am
city.
so
To anyone
happy.
else, it might have looked ordinary. To Grace, it looked like a miracle. She placed her backpack on the floor. Then she removed her mother's Bible. She knelt beside the bed. "Lord, you gave me more than a home. You gave me hope." Months later, Grace returned to the park where she had once slept on a cold bench. She carried bags filled with sandwiches, blankets, and bottled water. One by one, she handed them to people living on the streets.
Grace.
Many were shocked. One
All
elderly
thanks to
man
God.
asked, "Why are you helping us?" Grace smiled. "Because someone helped me when I had nothing." One rainy afternoon, Grace noticed a young woman sitting alone outside the cafe. She looked frightened. She clutched a worn backpack against her chest. Grace's heart broke. She saw herself. She walked outside carrying a warm bowl of soup. "Hi, my name is Grace." Young woman
Hi,
looked down.
my name is
"I'm
Grace.
sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm not here to bother anyone."
Grace gently smiled. "Neither was I." The young woman looked confused. Grace sat beside her. There was a time when I slept on sidewalks just like this. Woman stared at her in disbelief. "You," Grace nodded. "Someone believed in me before I believed in myself."
Someone believed
She
in me
reached out her
before I
hand.
believed in
"Now,
myself.
let me believe in you."
Now,
Young woman began
let me
to cry.
believe in you.
She took Grace's hand. That single moment became the beginning of another miracle. Several years passed. Grace and Mrs. Carter worked together to open a small community center. They called it Hope House. It offered warm meals, temporary shelter, job training, clothing, and most importantly, a place where people were treated with dignity. Above the entrance hung a wooden sign carved with words Grace would never forget. "Everyone deserves to be seen." Hundreds of people found hope inside those walls. Many rebuilt their lives. Some returned years later, not for help, but to volunteer. The miracle continued to grow. One Sunday, the church celebrated the anniversary of Hope House. Pastor Michael invited Grace to share her story. As she stepped onto the stage, she saw Samuel sitting in the front row, older now, his hair completely white, but his smile was exactly the same. Grace took a deep breath. "I used to think my worst day was the day I became homeless." She paused. "But now I realize
But
it was
now
the
I
day
realize
almost gave up."
it was
Room
the day
became
I almost
silent. She
gave up.
continued. If you're
If you're listening today and you feel
if
forgotten,
you think your life is
if you
over,
think your life
please
is
hear me.
over,
Your
please
story
hear
isn't
me. Your
finished.
story isn't finished.
Chapter you're living in today is not the ending.
The chapter you're living in
Sometimes
today
God
is
writes
not
his
the
greatest
ending.
miracles on the pages we wanted
Sometimes
to tear
God
out.
writes his greatest
Many people
miracles
wiped
on the
away
pages we
tears.
wanted to
Grace
tear
looked at
out.
Samuel. Thank you
For
seeing me
when the world
Samuel
didn't.
smiled and quietly
It was never
replied,
me.
"It was
It was
never
God."
me. It was God." Closing narration years later, people would ask Grace how she survived losing everything. She always gave the same answer. "I didn't survive
because I was strong.
I survived
because God sent ordinary people who chose kindness
became the miracle
over-
that changed my life."
And one
So
act
the
of
next time you
kindness
see someone who feels invisible,
became the
remember
miracle
Grace,
that
because one
changed my
smile,
life.
one meal, one conversation, one helping hand may become the miracle that changes
Thank you,
someone's
Lord.
life forever.